We give much respect to our military and armed forces. We hold our soldiers in the highest regard. We celebrate them, respect them, honor them. Children look up to uniformed military members and love to emulate them. Military uniformed officers are pillars of high standards and bravery in our society and community. But no one is perfect. Everyone makes mistakes, especially when stakes are high, and the pressure is even higher. To err is human, and with that in mind, here are 10 of the worst military battle mistakes in history. Battle of France. The French armed forces are currently the largest in the European Union, and throughout the years, the French military has been successful and impressive, including in conflicts like the 100 Days War, the American Revolution, and World War I. However, the Battle of France during World War II was not exactly France's finest moment. In 1940, the French military was aware that German forces were planning an invasion. The French attempted to prepare for this invasion using training efforts, modern weapons, and equipment. As well thought out as that strategy may have been, the French made two major assumptions. Those two assumptions would eventually be the cause of their downfall in the battle with the Germans. First, there was the geographical terrain challenge the French considered to be a deterrent for the German army, and that they wouldn't be able to get through the bunker-fortified Maginot Line. The only way through was the Ardennes Forest, a region of extensive forest area which contained rough terrain, with rolling hills and ridges. The challenging landscape would have prevented an invasion through there, or so the French thought. The second mistaken assumption was that Belgium would not fall to German troops for weeks or even months, giving the French much more time to mobilize. However, the German tanks had no trouble rolling right through the Ardennes forest with their sophisticated gear, and Belgium fell to the Germans within days instead of weeks or months. Even though the French armed forces had more modern equipment and more manpower, they fell to the German army in only 46 days because of these two blunders. 2 million troops were taken as prisoners, and thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed or seized. Most of France was then under Germany's control. Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway Islands was planned by the Japanese to be a follow-up strike to Pearl Harbor. It was meant to be an ambush 6 months after Pearl Harbor's attack to achieve Japan's goal of removing the United States from power in the Pacific. Japan had hoped to lure the US forces into a battle that the Americans would think they could win, and then surprise them with more forces than America may have anticipated. Japan planned to wipe out much of the US's carrier ships and aircraft. However, the United States was a step ahead of Japan. The US Navy had cracked the Japanese communication codes using sophisticated de-encryption techniques. The attack location and time were deciphered, and American forces set an ambush for the Japanese and intercepted the attack. Japanese aircraft were outnumbered by the US, and they lost almost 250 planes in the fight. They also lost 3 aircraft carriers, while the US lost only 1. This significant battle win for the US in World War II tipped the balance of power in the Pacific. Battle of Stalingrad. The German army made several mistaken assumptions about the Soviet Union and its people. Germans believed that the Soviets were racially inferior to them and that they would fail to defend themselves. The Germans also assumed that the Soviets were not coordinated or organized, and that their system would immediately crumble at the first assault by the Germans. But as we know, racism and assumptions are not viable strategies for battle, or for anything for that matter. The Soviets put up an impressive fight against the German invasion. They fought for every foot of territory that the Germans attempted to take. Stalingrad was significant because it was one of the Soviet Union's biggest industrial cities. The Soviets knew that the Germans would be at a disadvantage, fighting in harsh winter conditions they weren't accustomed to. The Germans lost about 800,000 out of 1 million troops they sent to Stalingrad. Even though the Soviets actually lost more men, they battled hard against the Germans and depleted their supplies of food and ammunition, forcing them to retreat backward. The Battle of Adwa. How does a poor African nation triumph over a European superpower? At the time, in 1896, it seemed almost easy because of two key mistakes by the invading party. Africa had been carved up among European powers. The Kingdom of Italy had already acquired 2 African territories, but had intended to improve its position in the African continent by conquering Ethiopia, which was neighboring the territory they already controlled. However, the Italian army was vastly outnumbered by the Ethiopians. Underestimating Ethiopia's population was a simple mistake that could have easily been avoided. Additionally, the Italians were underprepared with inadequate maps, old model guns, poor communication equipment. To make matters worse, they were not properly outfitted with footwear for the rocky ground in Ethiopia. Ethiopia easily defeated the Italians and thusly gained their independence as a state. As if that wasn't good enough news, when Italy had retreated, they just abandoned all their military equipment. Even though it was out-of-date equipment, all that gear was a big gain for the Ethiopians. Retreat from Moscow. Napoleon Bonaparte was a French military leader who rose to prominence during the French Revolution. Napoleon led several successful battles during the French Revolutionary Wars, including the 100 Days War. He was Emperor of France for 10 years, from 1804 to 1814. In 1812, he led an army on a mission to invade Russia. Almost 700,000 men, made up of the French and their allies, fought against Russia. Russia put up a tough fight, but Napoleon and his army eventually captured Moscow. The Russians would not be defeated, however, and they refused to succumb to the French army. Napoleon and his men were short on supplies, so they retreated at his direction. He chose to return the same way they had come, but there was no food nor shelter to be found. Even worse, the French army was not prepared for the bitter Russian winter weather. Without adequate clothing, the malnourished soldiers suffered from frostbite and sickness. In their weakened state, Russian raids were easily won. Half of Napoleon's men perished on their way out of Russia. Another 100,000 were captured, and many more were too sick or too injured for service. By advancing too far, choosing the wrong route back, and being underprepared, Napoleon lost his army in one of the biggest battle mistakes in history. Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the code name for the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. The operation was part of Nazi Germany's ideological goals to conquer and take over the Soviet Union. The intent was to seize the oil resources and the agricultural offerings of the Soviet Union, and then to use its people, the Slavs, Polish, and Russians, as slaves. Hitler ordered the invasion of Russia, but he was impatient and the invasion was poorly timed. As he ordered his troops to head deeper into Russian territory, the worst enemy arrived: the Russian winter. Snow, ice, and below freezing temperatures not only slowed down the troops, but also rendered the equipment and weapons useless. The Russians, however, were accustomed to fighting in the winter, and they successfully beat back the Germans. Battle of Waterloo. It all began on June 18, 1815. Napoleon had a major decision to make while leading his troops into battle. He was leading a fight for Waterloo, which is part of present-day Belgium, but at the time was part of the Netherlands. The battle was fought between Napoleon's French army and Allied forces consisting of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German soldiers. However, the Prussian army would join the battle on the side of the British army. Napoleon knew his army would have not been able to defeat both the British and the Prussian armies together. 2 days prior to Waterloo, Napoleon had won another battle. His cavalry and infantry were tired, and on top of that, it had rained the night before. Napoleon faced the dilemma of making a tough decision. Would he trudge his troops through the mud and further tire them out just prior to the battle? Or would he wait a day so the troops could rest and the ground could dry out? Waiting one more day, however, meant risking the arrival of the Prussian army to reinforce the British army. Napoleon's decision cost him the battle and eventually the war. After the loss at Waterloo, Napoleon never managed to regroup. The battle marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which took the lives of 5 million people. Battle of Little Bighorn. Lieutenant Colonel George Custer was an Army officer and cavalry commander in the American Civil War and the American Indian Wars. He had been dubbed the Boy General because of his early success in battle as a young man and had been promoted through the ranks to general before the age of 25. The Battle of Little Bighorn was fought in June of 1876 in what is now Montana. The battle was led by Custer against the Northern Plain Indians, led by Sitting Bull, to take over the land. Custer decided to launch the attack on the tribes from several different directions to catch them by surprise, not giving them any time for any sort of organized formation. 647 troops attacked the tribesmen along the Little Bighorn River. However, the tribes knew that Custer was approaching, and they were waiting. The battle was over in 24 hours. All 647 troops were killed, and Custer not only lost the battle, but also his life. The battle is often called Custer's Last Stand, and legend has it that the sole survivor of the battle was a lone horse. Battle of Isandlwana. The Battle of Isandlwana was the first major battle between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom of South Africa when Britain was attempting a claim to South African territories. A Zulu force of 20,000 attacked the British colony, consisting of about 2,000 troops and civilians. The Zulus were only equipped with traditional iron spears and cowhide shields, as well as old, outdated muskets and rifles, for which they were not properly trained. The Brits, however, were armed with modern rifles and high-tech guns, but they were unprepared, poorly led, and badly deployed. So, despite their significant disadvantage in weapons technology, the Zulus ultimately defeated the British. Not only did they outnumber the British by 100 to 1, but they all but wiped out the entire British army of 2,000 men, while they only lost about half that number of their own warriors. Two primary mistakes on the part of the British are to blame for their major defeat. One was their lack of organization once they learned of the impending Zulu attack. The other was their lack of effort to conceal their location. The Zulus, who were thought to be unsophisticated, did just the opposite and made a very successful effort to conceal their location until they were within a few hours of striking distance of the enemy. The significant Zulu victory at Isandlwana forced the main British forces out of Zululand. Philippines Campaign. The Philippines Campaign, also known as the Battle of the Philippines, was the invasion of the Philippines by Japan during World War II. The islands were defended by the Filipino forces as well as the United States troops in an attempt to expel Japanese forces occupying the Philippines. The defense outnumbered the Japanese. However, they were a mix of non-combat experienced National Guard troops and newly created troop units. The Japanese used first-line troops at the beginning of the attack, which enabled a quick victory during the first month. With over 120,000 American and Filipino military personnel lost, the conquest of the Philippines by the Japanese is often considered the worst military defeat in United States history.